Hello everyone, this is John from RPGs and More. And in today's video, I'm going to talk to you, or I'd like to talk to you, excuse me. I'd like to talk to you about transportation. Now, the reason why I should probably take a drink before I do this is because last night I recorded a video where I was going to lay out the three basic forms of transportation for a fantasy-themed campaign, or at least a medieval fantasy-themed campaign. And I thought I was pretty succinct until I finished the video, and I looked at the time and realized that I had talked for nearly an hour. And there was still a lot that I had only barely scratched the surface of. So instead, I have chosen to break this up over several videos, and I will attempt to cover each topic in turn. So tonight, I want to talk to you about the first of these topics, and that is roads in your fantasy world. And we're going to base this on more practical considerations when it comes to roads. Mostly because a lot of other transportation issues dovetail off of how and where your roads are placed in your fantasy world. So one of the first things that you need to decide when creating a world is, where do the roads come from? Are these roads things that were built by an ancient civilization and they're relics of the days long past, like the Roman roads were to our medieval and Renaissance era? Are these roads more modern constructions, things that, are there current road building projects that go on? Or are they kind of a slapdash thing? People put up a road when they feel like it, and most of it's just paths that people have trod on for so long that they're just trod into the mud, quite seriously. These things can be important to a fantasy world, and a lot of it also depends upon what type of world you are running. If you are running a world that is well explored and well established, and there are countries and there are nations and there are guilds and lots of organizations and lots of communication, then it's very likely that you're going to have a significant network of roads. If, on the other hand, you are running what's kind of like a points of light campaign, and that references the idea that there are individual places where civilization is bright, and there are a city, a town, a castle, and between all of these locations is just the great unknown because some catastrophe happened that rendered most of the world into wilderness or into some sort of unknown thing. Maybe there was a big old mist or miasma that rose up from the ground and isolated every village and town from each other, and now it's suddenly been lifted and people are exploring again. Maybe there was an apocalypse and you're now recovering from the apocalypse. Maybe there was a disease, a sickness, a plague that swept across the nation, and now the plague has finally passed and people are starting to come back to things again. Maybe your world has had its own dark ages and is starting to return. In those situations, unless your roads were an ancient construction from a previous empire, it's very likely that they would be few and far between, in which case most of your commerce, most of your traveling would be done via river, and the river becomes the road. So think about how roads work, but also how your rivers work, because the two become interconnected with a lot of early transportation issues, before self-driving vehicles became a thing. And by self-driving, I mean a vehicle that doesn't require a horse. So I realize that now we're having autonomous cars being developed, and I think that's really awesome, but that's not the topic that we're talking about here. So, roads. How are they built in your world? How do you want your roads to be built? Do you want your roads to be an affair that is just kind of is a dirt path and people just keep the weeds off of it and otherwise let it be as it is. You can do that. Absolutely. But there are repercussions for that. One of the repercussions being, and one should be fairly obvious, whenever there's rain, that road's going to get muddy as heck. And there's going to be a lot of, people are going to not want to use that road. In fact, in a lot of some places, there were actually rules saying that you could go off of the road onto someone's private land in order to avoid mud in places where, mud was a significant concern because the roads were kind of not good. So consider that when you want to use those dirt paths. They can be a great source of adventure in and of itself because the road is becoming impassable, so your heroes can choose. Maybe it's actively raining at the moment because you should be using weather. Please use weather. Use it to your advantage. Not every day is a sunny day. And maybe it's raining cats and dogs and the road is becoming quickly impassable. Your party can either choose to try to forge on through towards the inn or the hostel or the village they know that is far up ahead somewhere, or they can veer off of the road onto the grass, and maybe there's like a hut that belongs to some kind old woman over that way, and then there's actually a side adventure over there. Or the party could develop a side adventure because maybe that kind old woman needs help with something. It could be benign, it could be part of a larger conspiracy, or it could just be, maybe she really is an evil old witch that is, eating babies. I really hope not, and, please don't, that this is not a thing that I suggest, but I know that those stories did happen in our collective mythology. So you could dive into that a little closer. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to talk about a lot of harsh topics, or like I did just now. So I shouldn't have said that. I apologize. But anyway, the idea being that it could be this nice old woman, or it could be a mean old woman who's doing bad things, or it could be something completely unrelated. Maybe it's a hermit who happens to know about some details regarding a great quest. Maybe they're trying to find the holy chalice of the religion of your world. And this hermit happens to know some secrets about that. But if they had just continued straight along the road, they would have missed them. And so you can use the road as a vehicle to get them off of the road onto something else. Another thing to consider is a lot of dirt paths tended to get wagon ruts in them. When people would use them a lot, a rut would form. And for those who don't know, a rut is when it's kind of like a divot. It is a part of the road where the wheels tend to just go in the same spot over and over and over again, and so it indents. It indents, and the indentions get deeper and deeper every year. Sometimes they get deeper and deeper every time it rains, because it rains and the wagons gouge out even deeper rents into the mud. And then everything dries, and suddenly you've got these really high-walled, stiff ruts that the wheels only barely fit into, and they break an axle. And these are things that can also play into your adventures, and they could cost your heroes resources, but they could also be sources of interesting adventure, because maybe there's a wagon that's stuck on the road, and the heroes then have an opportunity to be heroes by, are they going to stop and help, this farmer or this shepherd, fix the wagon that they need to use, or are they going to just pass on by because, we're far too busy for that? It's a test of character. But let's see. Let's look at a few other things. Stone or gravel or other materials could be used for roads. Paving was not necessarily, the Romans paved. They paved in stone blocks. Usually, if I recall correctly, and I'm sorry, I may get this wrong, it's been a few years, but if I recall correctly, most of the Roman roads started with hard-packed earth, and then there was a layer of logs or wood that was placed over that, kind of creating a bit of a cushion, so to speak. And then over that was placed a layer of stone blocks in order to create the paving. And part of that, they wanted to get it really thick. I think there was also a layer of gravel in there as well. But they wanted the stone blocks there because that is what made the road smooth. And over time they get worn down and things like that. And weeds would grow up in between the individual blocks. And if the road wasn't taken care of, then it could quickly disintegrate into something else. But at the same time, these were built pretty solidly, and the Romans did have access to, an early form of concrete, which is pretty fantastic when you think about it. You can do that with your fantasy world. You can have these great road builders that existed in the past for whatever reason and aren't here anymore, but we still use their roads. Why not? Go for it. And maybe part of that could be the fun aspect of where did they build the roads to, and are the places they built the roads to still in existence today? Maybe their roads lead to the places that are now the big dungeons in your world. These big complexes full of ancient machinery or ancient magical curses and lots of monsters and stuff like that. And so are these roads to be used by adventurers trying to get there? Are they sought out as a means for adventurers to find this loot? Or are they something to be avoided because they're dangerous, because they are connected to these ancient magical sites? Or are they sought out because they are the safest and fastest way to travel from point A to point B? So that's like, what are your roads made out of? Also consider where your roads are going, because most people assume the road is going to go from point A to point B by the shortest possible distance. This is kind of true, especially in the modern day, because we have vehicles that are capable of going up and down hills without too much trouble, and because we have managed to blast paths straight through most of the hills that our vehicles can't easily climb up and over. That requires a lot of logistics. It requires a lot of planning. During the medieval era, they didn't necessarily have access to those things. And so a lot of roads tended to meander. They would go, instead of going through the hill, they would go around the hill. And they might have to go around for quite a while. Instead of going through the forest and chopping a huge, massive path through it, which they might do if they had the manpower for it, or they would go around the forest and establish a road that way along the border of the forest where it was a lot easier to clear a path. These are, think about these things when you start placing your roads, if you're placing roads at all. And imagine what you can do in order to make your roads a little more interesting. So it's not just a straight line from one place to another, unless you really just want that and you want to have that well-established world where you don't have to think about it. I personally like the idea of making the journey from the town to the dungeon, or from one town to when you finish the one dungeon, you're going to go to the next town to find the next dungeon. That journey should mean something. That journey should be a part of the adventure. And not just like hand waving and saying, oh, you spend a week on the road and what do you guys do when you're on your downtime while you're traveling? Like to me, that's boring, because having gone on many family road trips that lasted multiple days, going from say California to Illinois, there's stuff to do and see along the way. Even when you are going as fast as you can legally, and not stopping, you're still going to encounter stuff along the way. And our role-playing games should kind of reflect that. There may not be much, but there's going to be something that's going to make you stop and go, wow, that's different. And I think that's kind of where hex crawl style games come in. And that's something that the hex crawl game did really well and does really well. And I'm starting to get myself back into that. I'm doing some more research on how to create hex crawl games. So when I start doing my next solo adventure, I want to include a hex crawling element to it, because I want that journey to mean something. And so therefore, roads, or the path between places, it's good to have them meander. It's good to have them have things in the way. Obstacles or anything that needs to get crossed. You can treat it in a way like the old Oregon Trail computer game that many of us in America, at least, usually played when we were in school, because it taught you a lot about planning. It taught you a lot about where we have so much weight in our wagon, so let's buy the supplies we think we're going to need in order to get us there, and then we have to plan how fast we're going to go. We have to decide, are we going to try to ford a river? Are we going to pay the toll in cash money to get across? Are we going to, hunt for food? Or are we going to try to carry so much food that there's no way we need to stop for a long time? There's all these things that you kind of have to decide even before you set out on your journey. And so I think it's really kind of cool to treat a journey in D&D or in any role-playing game like that. Now, using whatever system you want to cover equipment and logistics. If you want to get detail-oriented about it, cool, do that. If you want to just kind of have equipment slots where you spend points and roll dice in order to get the things you need, that's fine too. But make it part of the journey. Make it fun. Make it interesting. And not everyone has to die from dysentery, right? But maybe someone gets sick at least. Make it mean something. All right. So that's a little bit about roads. But let's consider other aspects of roads. One of those is bridges. Bridges to get over rivers. That's a big deal. Like, we maybe don't think about that so much in the modern day, unless you, because if you're driving in a car, you go over a bridge, it's a bridge, whatever. But what I would like to encourage people to do at some point, legally, don't break any laws doing this. I spent some time, because at some point I visited San Francisco, and I spent some time walking around one of the entrances to the Golden Gate Bridge and examining all the infrastructure that goes into that bridge, all the different pieces that allow that bridge to work, not just the stuff above, but the stuff below as well. And the stuff above is significant, but it's also famous. We've got these big sweeping arches, not arches, but the big sweeping, the suspension wires that go all the way up. There's the tall posts that help to suspend everything and creating the iconic image of the Golden Gate Bridge. But there's also a lot of stuff going on underneath that bridge, and it is huge. If you physically put yourself next to it, you get an idea of just how big of a structure this is and how massive an undertaking it was. Even with that, relatively modern technology and infrastructure behind building it. This was a feat of engineering, and it remains a very powerful feat of engineering. Imagine a medieval society. They would not be able to bridge that gap. It would be impossible for them. So think about that when you're placing your crossings on rivers. A lot of crossings on rivers would be done via a ferry. And this ferry could be, a raft that travels from one side to the next, thanks to some ropes that are run through it. And then, the ferryman kind of, maybe they're turning a wheel in order to pull the ferry along the ropes. Maybe they're physically pulling the rope in order to keep that ferry going along it. Whatever mechanism works. But that would be how goods and people would be taken from one part of the road when the road meets the river to the other side. Another common way to get across a river would be like a causeway. Excuse me about that. I knocked over a paint bottle. Be a causeway, which would go underneath the river, and you would kind of walk along the path as the water of the river or the stream or the brook or whatever runs over your feet, and so you're still getting wet, but at the same time you're on a solid surface, you're solid road, and it's less likely you're going to get bogged down or swept away. Other options being actual bridges being built, a lot of them being built from wood, some from stone. These are huge undertakings. These are the things that would take decades to finish in some cases. be very careful where you place them. And think about it, because when they become that rare, when they become that big of a deal in your campaign world to have a bridge that crosses X river, suddenly that location becomes really important, because that's where someone's going to want to put fortifications to control the river crossing. River crossings, especially in warfare, were a massive, massive thing that people wanted to control. The Battle of Stirling, made, semi-famous, unfortunately, by the way that it was mishandled in the movie Braveheart. Not knocking Mel Gibson. It was a great movie, and I loved that movie when I was growing up. But the Battle of Stirling actually took place on a bridge. And it took place on a bridge because that bridge was an important means of transportation. I think it was like the only bridge for a long time on either side that would allow someone to get across that area. So controlling that bridge during that fight was vital, and that is why they fought there. In your campaign world, monsters would want to control bridges. They don't exist just for a troll to sit underneath it and say, fee, fi, fo, fum, you owe me some gold to get across my bridge. A troll might do that. And why not? Because at that point, they are like the monster controlling the bridge. But goblins would do the same thing. Goblins would want to control it if they could figure out a way to control a bridge. If they could figure out a way to control a ferry, and you might have a goblin-run ferry. Why not? And if the goblins are actually really good at running that ferry, maybe they have a reason to not go raiding and stealing sheep in the middle of the night. Or maybe they use it as a means to find out where all the best shepherds are to steal their sheep later, because they know where people cross the river. But having that as part of your roads and considering how your roads are going to cross rivers or how they're going to cross various terrain is an important thing. And it is entirely possible to have highly developed roads and badly developed bridges, or bridges that have washed out over the years because they weren't maintained. You can have beautiful roads that were not maintained. But let's look at how can we make this an adventure, make it fantastical. There's a few different things. Like one, roads over swamps. Almost forgot. So if you had a swamp or a moor, one of the common things to do would be to build a raised wooden roadway that passed over it on stilts. So it's kind of like walking over a long dock, going from island to island to island in this swamp or the moor. And that was something that was done during the medieval and Renaissance era for people who needed to get through those areas in order to, whether it was mining tin or traveling, because that was the quickest way to get there by several magnitudes. That was another kind of road that you would see. Excuse me. So the other thing we can do is, let's make our roads fantastical. Let's make our roads interesting to the campaign. What if the road is a project that is being rebuilt? And so suddenly your adventurers could be hired to maybe safeguard a section of road that is currently being worked on by the local lord's people. And they are being harassed by some unknown creatures. And those unknown creatures are actually stone golems that were part of an ancient part of this construction from long, long ago. The stone golems are actually trying, they were originally designed to protect the road, but the road has become so badly eroded, their orders have eroded over time, and now they've become a nuisance. But if they could be, maybe they could be defeated, or maybe they could somehow, if you could find where their control is, you could turn them into laborers in order to restore their original programming and have them help you repair the road. But then you'd have to find out where they come from, where their original, how can you redo their programming? Could it be a simple thing to do, or would it be very complicated? All right. Good apple juice. Another thing we could do is river crossings like we mentioned, are kind of a big deal. So let's make them more interesting. Now let's say you've got a flying ferry going across. Now maybe it's not crossing a river. Maybe it's crossing from one cliff to another over a massive chasm. And so instead of a ferry, like it's floating on a raft, you've got a little like dirigible that goes from point A to point B and back again over and over again. It could be run by some elves, some elves that are all about flight and flying, and they love birds and things like that. Sure, why not? Maybe you've got bird people in your world. People, they're they look like humans, but they got bird wings on their backs, and they love to, they love all things flying, and so they love to find ways to keep themselves aloft and to show other people the joy of flying as well, because why should they be the only ones to experience this happiness? Maybe they're not elitist about it. And so they create this means, for people to travel from place to place via air. And it's kind of like an air ferry or an air road. That's a possibility. Let's see, other things. A road actually built up into the sky. So someone decides that maybe there is a flying castle floating up in the sky somewhere, and someone's decided to build a road to it. That sounds like a multi-year project to me. And maybe the characters come across that project mid-process. Maybe they do a mission to help the architect of this project. Maybe they do a mission to hinder the architect of this project because the owner of that castle hires them to hey, I don't want this person to build a road to my castle. Stop them. Or maybe they don't even realize that they're working for a person that lives in that castle. Maybe. Or, let's see, that the road that's being built, is it going to meet up with the castle? Is the castle going to kind of run into it and then they're going to cinch it up? Is it really going to be kind of like a dock that the castle just kind of stops at every once in a while? Some more options. There's ways you can make that road work. There's also ferry roads that go through forests. These are a big thing in myths. Roads that go through a forest that you then get lost in because they keep dividing and dividing and dividing and going off in places. Or they don't. But the longer you walk along that road, you're thinking you're going in the same direction, then you realize that you're passing the same tree over and over and over again, and you're in some kind of loop, but you're not turning. You're not going anything. So there's fantastical roads, magical roads. Have some fun with that. There's a lot of stuff in mythology about roads that would allow us or serve as inspiration for our roads to become part of the adventure, to become the purpose of the adventure itself, and not just a means to get from point A to point B, but actually be the point B. And you're not even in, maybe you didn't even know it. So think about your roads. Think about how they exist, why they exist. Do they go someplace that your players cannot predict or have not predicted? Does that road maybe travel to a different, not just a different place, but a different time? Roads through time could be a really cool part of your campaign setting. If a form of time travel is codified and real, and you can pass through this road, through an arch in this road, and then you will be somewhere else, or somewhen else. Is it something that's known? Is it something that is part of the culture? Or is it something that is not always active? Maybe only on the full moon of the third month of your year does this portal actually activate. And is it visible when it does? Or is it something that's accidental and you can't tell when you've passed through it until it's too late? Is it one way? Is your road a one-way road? Is it one of those things where, like, as long as you're walking along the road in one direction, you see a road and it's beautiful and it's great, but the moment you're like, I think I went the wrong way, you turn around and the road is gone. And you're like, well, where did this road? I was just on it. And then you turn around again and the road's, there it is. With a nice brick road going in that direction. But then you turn around and take a couple of steps and suddenly you're in tall grass. There's no road. And why would that road exist? What would cause that to happen? What kind of fantastical thing is guiding your player characters towards a certain destination? Is it benign? Is it malevolent? Is it trying to force them to go someplace that they're not going to want to be? Or is it and you got to be careful with that one, because it might feel to your players like you are literally railroading them, forcing them to go in one direction. So I wouldn't use that too often, but it might be kind of neat to have a road that does that for a specific reason, and telegraph it to your players ahead of time so that they know, like, hey, like, there's this ferry road that only goes one way, and your players can be like, that's impossible. Like, roads always go two ways. Like, there's no way to have a road that only goes one way. What are they, crazy? And then they encounter it. There's a lot of encounters that can happen on roads, whether it's from bandits or wild animals. Wild animals were definitely a thing during the medieval era. Wolves were scary. Bears were super scary. Even a buck could be deadly if you were dumb enough to try to antagonize the animal, or if you were traveling through the forest during the wrong time of year. So, when thinking about the dangerous things on a road, I would actually encourage you to use wild animals. Wild animal encounters would have been far more common during that time than, say, bandits or brigands. And I think that's something that we don't really consider too often. And part of that's because animals are cute, and a lot of people don't like the idea of hurting an animal, or hurting, especially dogs. Like, no one seems to enjoy the idea of a wolf pack hunting them, and so you need to actually fight the wolves off. Like, they don't want to do that. Or a pack of wild dogs. Even though that was very much something that would happen, and in some places in our world does happen today. Packs of wild dogs will hunt people if that's what they think they need to do in order to get food in certain countries. It's real. But it's not something that a lot of people from a Western, America or Western Europe mindset like to think about too much, because we're used to wild animals being something we visit in the zoo, or something that we go out and look at, when we're going hunting, or something really cute to see during a YouTube video. For the most part, wild things are separate and other, or they are adorable for a lot of people. And during the time that we often emulate with our role-playing games, that was not the case. Wild animals were dangerous. Wild animals were a serious, serious threat to everyone. At some point, I might talk about a very real story that I encountered a while ago, thanks to a channel called Bedtime Stories. Really great channel, by the way. If you enjoy strange stories of the supernatural or the macabre, I recommend the channel Bedtime Stories. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, but they told a story about a wolf king in Paris, and how this king of wolves, who really was a wolf, led a huge pack of other wolves, ravaging the countryside of Paris, of France, and actually invaded the city of Paris itself. And there was this huge battle fought between the city guard and this wolf pack in front of like a cathedral in Paris. I mean, this is a real historical event. It actually happened. And while it is a tragedy on many levels because of how many lives, both human and wolf, that were lost in this, it is an incredible story. And it's something you could use in your games. You can actually have wild animals or super packs of intelligent wild animals invade a city. And then your players would have to deal with that one way or another. So use that. Use that on your roads. Make your roads so that they're not just like, oh, we're going on a road trip, having some fun. We're going to talk about stuff, and then tonight we're going to camp and eat some s'mores around the fire. You can do that if that's what you really, if that's your jam, go for it. But you don't. But there's a lot more to it. All right, but that's enough for tonight. I will talk more. I could go on ad nauseum about so many of these topics because I kind of grew up learning about logistics, about travel. I will talk about them in a future video, but for right now, let's just say that roads are important. Think about them. Consider them carefully. And consider not using them. Consider, having them not be in your campaign world, and then your players get to create them. And wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't them getting to map out a new route from one place to another and deciding where that road's going to be built as part of the campaign setting, sort of a hex crawl situation? That would be kind of cool. All right, anyway, thank you so much for sticking around, those of you who have. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, maybe a comment as well. Let me know if this was something you enjoyed. If this was something that you thought was a bit too specific, let me know that too. I can try to get more general. If there's something in particular about roads that you want me to talk about a little bit more in detail, cool. If you like the idea of the wolf story and you want me to kind of relate my own take on it necessarily, then that's awesome. Let me know, and I'll try to talk about that and talk about how we could use that in our D&D games a bit more and do a whole video on that one. The next video I want to talk about river travel, and I want to talk about seagoing travel. And then I also want to do a video about traveling by foot and what that could mean for our D&D campaigns. And then there'll be another video all about traveling by wagon or coach. And then I do want to do a video, and then this may be a separate video, or maybe combined with traveling by wagon. Excuse me. But I want to talk about the logistics and shipping of equipment, shipping of items from one city to another, from one town to another, and trade, and how that can really affect things depending on how detailed you want to get in that sort of thing. Because you can actually have an entire campaign based around running trade routes and have it be rather interesting. So, again, there's a lot. Thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you have a wonderful day, and peace be with you. Bye-bye now.